Welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, this is where we tell stories about ordinary people who find themselves at the edge of something they never expected. If stories like that pull you in, consider following along for more. Now, let's begin. Mary Ann Colby had exactly $53 to her name and 48 cents in a jar she'd stopped counting weeks ago because counting made it worse. She sat in her car outside the county auction house in Belhaven, engine off to save gas, watching a man in a canvas coat tape a notice to the door, "Foreclosure sale, properties as is." She wasn't there for the farmhouse 2 lots down, or the strip mall unit with the collapsed roof. She was there because 6 weeks ago she'd lost her apartment, her job at the textile plant, and, quietly, without announcement, the last of her savings to a medical bill that had arrived like a verdict. She was 34 years old and living out of a Honda with 190,000 miles on it. The auctioneer moved fast, the way they always did, like slowing down might let someone reconsider. When he got to the last item on the list, a boarded-up chapel out on Route 9, condemned, no takers, minimum bid $50 just to clear it off the county books, nobody raised a hand. Mary Ann raised hers before she'd decided to. $50, the auctioneer said, more surprised than pleased. Going once, going twice, sold, to the woman in the blue coat. Afterward, in the parking lot, a man named Desmond Pratt caught her arm. He was older, weathered, with the careful hands of someone who'd spent a life fixing things other people had given up on, and he carried a battered leather folder stuffed with old photographs, like he was afraid the past might otherwise disappear. "You bought St. Agnes," he said, not quite a question. "I bought a building," Mary Ann said. "I don't know anything about a saint." Desmond studied her for a long moment. "That church has been locked for 40 years. Nobody in this town will set foot past the doors." He hesitated, like he was deciding whether to say more. "There are stories." "I don't have money for stories," Mary Ann said. "I have $50 and nowhere else to sleep." Desmond didn't argue. He just handed her a rusted key from his folder, one he'd apparently been keeping for reasons he didn't explain, and said quietly, "Then I hope you find whatever you're looking for in there. Just be careful with the altar." Mary Ann didn't ask why. She should have. That night, she drove out to Route 9 as the sky went the color of a bruise, and stood in front of a church that looked like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of person would finally come back for it. The key stuck at first, then turned with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the lock itself. Mary Ann pushed the door open, and the smell hit her before anything else did. Dust, old wax, and something faintly sweet underneath, like flowers pressed between the pages of a book decades ago and never removed. Moonlight came through a broken section of stained glass near the roofline, throwing a crooked shard of blue and red across the floor. She stepped inside with her phone flashlight raised, and the beam caught rows of pews still standing, some tipped on their sides, a thick coat of dust over everything, like a blanket someone had forgotten to pull off. At the front of the church, the altar remained intact, carved stone, chipped at the corners, with a faded cloth still draped across it that might once have been white. She should have felt afraid. Instead, she felt something closer to recognition, as if the building understood exactly what it meant to be abandoned and left standing anyway. Mary Ann spent that first night wrapped in a blanket from her car, sleeping in a pew, because it was drier than sleeping outside, and in the morning she woke to sunlight pouring through the broken window, like something had decided to forgive her for coming. She spent the next several days doing what she could. Sweeping, clearing debris, prying boards off windows to let in light and air. It gave her hands something to do besides shake, and it gave her mind something to focus on, besides the calls she wasn't getting back and the apartment listings she couldn't afford. On the 4th day, Desmond came by, unannounced, carrying a thermos of coffee and a folding chair like he intended to stay a while. "You're still here," he said, not quite surprised. "Where else would I be?" He set the chair down but didn't sit in it. Instead, he walked the length of the church slowly, running a hand along the pews, his expression somewhere between grief and memory. "My mother was married here," he said, "before the town decided the building wasn't worth saving. Before a lot of things got decided without asking anyone who actually lived here. What happened to it? Money," he said simply, "and then nobody had the money to fix what the first lack of money broke. That's usually how it goes." Marianne looked toward the altar, its cloth stirring faintly in a draft from the window she'd uncovered that morning. "You said to be careful with it." "The altar? Why?" Desmond was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "There's a story," he said finally, "about something being placed under it, a long time before I was born. Nobody living has ever confirmed it. Nobody living has ever gone looking either. Some things, people decide it's safer not to know." "I've got nothing left to protect," Marianne said. "I think I can handle finding out." Desmond didn't try to stop her. He just picked up his folding chair, unfolded it a few feet back from the altar, and sat down to watch. The altar cloth came away easier than Marianne expected. Decades of dust lifting into the air in a pale cloud that caught the light like something briefly alive. Underneath, the stone was carved with a shallow seam running along one edge, almost invisible unless you already knew to look for it, which told her someone had built this on purpose, not by accident of age or wear. She worked her fingers into the seam. Desmond stood now, coffee forgotten, watching without offering to help, as if some part of him needed this to belong entirely to her. The stone panel shifted, then it gave, sliding aside with a sound like held breath finally released. Inside was a metal box, rusted at the corners, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a bundle of papers and a small leather book. Marianne lifted the book out first, her hands unsteady, and opened it to a page near the middle. It was a ledger. Names, dates, small sums of money, written in a careful, looping hand. And beside many of the names, a single word: paid, or forgiven, or once, near the back, returned. "What is it?" Desmond asked, crouching beside her now, his voice low. Marianne read further, piecing it together as she went. "It's a debt record, but not the kind you'd think." She turned the book so he could see. Someone was paying off other people's debts, secretly, for years. Whoever kept this book was buying up people's mortgages, their medical bills, their loans, and forgiving them, quietly. Through the church, Desmond went very still. He took the ledger from her carefully, like it might dissolve, and flipped back toward the earliest pages. His breath caught. "This name," he said, tapping a faded line. "This is my mother's name, 1974. Beside it, forgiven. You didn't know? I always wondered how she kept the farm after my father died. She never told anyone. She just said someone had been kind to her once, and she didn't ask questions about kindness." He looked up at Marianne, and for the first time since she'd met him, his composure cracked. She always said if she ever found out who it was, she'd spend the rest of her life trying to repay it. Marianne looked back into the hollow beneath the altar and found one more thing tucked at the very bottom, a single folded letter, addressed to no one, dated the year the church had closed. She unfolded it slowly and began to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, uncertain yet of what she was about to give this man and what it might cost them both to know it. "To whoever finds this," Marianne read, "I have spent every dollar I was given more than I ever needed, on people who needed it more. I ask nothing in return, except that this church remain a place where no one is measured by what they owe. If the money runs out before I do, let this ledger stand as proof that it was never about the money at all." The letter wasn't signed. Marianne turned it over, searching for a name, but there was none. Only a small drawing in the corner, a single sparrow in flight, sketched in the same careful hand as the ledger entries. Desmond stared at the drawing for a long moment. "My mother used to draw sparrows," he said quietly, "on everything. Letters, birthday cards, the corners of her grocery lists. She said they reminded her that small things could still carry weight." He looked up, and something in his face had shifted, like a question he'd carried for 50 years had finally found its shape. I think this might have been her. Your mother forgave her own debt. No, he said slowly. I think she paid it forward. I think whoever helped her first taught her to do the same thing for someone else. And she never told me because she didn't want credit. She just wanted it to keep going. Marianne sat back against the cold stone of the altar, the ledger heavy in her lap, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in a condemned church with $50 to her name. The sense that she was standing inside something larger than her own bad luck. Something that had been quietly moving through this town for half a century, person to person, debt to forgiveness, long after anyone stopped watching. Word got out faster than Marianne expected. Ruth from the county archive. No, Desmond mentioned it to a cousin, who mentioned it to a neighbor, and within a week half of Belhaven knew that someone had found the old debt ledger of St. Agnes. People began showing up at the church, not out of curiosity, but recognition. An elderly man who remembered his father's grocery debt disappearing overnight. A woman who'd never understood how her family kept their house during the drought years. Each of them had a name in the book, and each name was a small, unclosed circle, finally meeting its beginning. Marianne watched them cry over pages of ink and dust, and she understood, slowly, that she hadn't just bought a building, she'd bought back a piece of the town's memory. And for the first time in 6 weeks, she stopped thinking about what she'd lost, and started thinking about what she might still be able to give. If you've ever been given something you couldn't repay, and it changed how you treated other people afterward, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear it. Marianne didn't sell the church. She thought about it. In the practical daylight hours, when her stomach reminded her that $50 and a full ledger didn't put food on the table. But every time she stood at the altar, she found she couldn't picture handing the building to someone who'd tear it down for the land. Instead, she and Desmond began quietly doing what the ledger had done before them, in whatever small way they could manage. Desmond had savings he'd never spent on himself. Marianne had time, and a growing list of names from people who came forward once they heard the church doors were open again. It wasn't the same scale as before. She didn't have anyone's fortune to give away. But she found that even a modest gesture, offered without condition, carried more weight than she'd expected. A grocery bill quietly settled. A month's rent covered for a family she barely knew. Small circles, closing one at a time. By autumn, St. Agnes had its windows repaired, its pews righted, its doors unlocked during daylight hours for anyone who wanted to sit in the quiet. Marianne moved into the old rectory next door. Modest and drafty, but hers, and took a part-time job at the hardware store in town. Enough to get by while the rest of her hours went into keeping the church standing. She kept the ledger in a glass case near the entrance, open to the page bearing Desmond's mother's name, the word forgiven, still legible after 50 years. Beside it, she started a second book, blank pages, waiting to be filled, for whoever wanted to carry the sparrow forward next. Desmond visited most evenings, no longer just checking on the building, but on her, and somewhere in the months of dust and repair and small kindnesses returned. Something quieter had grown between them, patient and unhurried, the way things do when neither person is in a rush to name what they're building. Marianne still thought, sometimes, about the woman in the parking lot who'd raised her hand for $50 because she had nothing left to lose. She didn't recognize herself in that memory anymore. Not entirely. She'd walked into a condemned building looking for a place to sleep, and found instead a debt someone had paid on her behalf, decades before she was ever born. The debt of believing a stranger's kindness might still be worth trusting. She never did find out who first started the sparrow. Some mysteries, she'd come to understand, weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be continued. Thank you for spending this story with us. If it moved you, consider subscribing, and we'll see you in the next one.